Welcome to Section 4 on expenses. Here we go. Your project for Section 4 is that you are going to buy health insurance and you're going to calculate how much it's going to cost you when some medical bills roll in. Should be interesting. Even if you live outside the US or if you never buy individual health insurance in your life, like it's only corporate or government, it's still there's still useful skills. It's a useful process of learning how a system like this can work. And a link to the project is below, and everything should be working, but we're doing this based off of, live sites, and changes happen and life changes. I will try to keep things as up to date as possible to make sure everything's rolling like it should. Let's quickly review expenses. Expenses, if you remember, it's what's going out the door plus whatever is depreciated or amortized. So for example, if your car is worth $10,000 one year and $9,000 the next year, it's like there's an extra $1,000 of expense. It's useful to classify expenses into two categories. One would be fixed expenses. These are expenses that you can't really control over a short period of time. So think, say, your rent. If your rent is $800, it's going to be $800 this month. It'll be $800 next month too. There's not much you can do to actually change that from one month to another. An opposite example would be something like variable expenses. And variable expenses would be something, say, like food. Your food budget could change a lot from month to month, or gasoline, or a variety of categories where from one month to another, it can change significantly depending on the change in price and the change in quantity that you consume. And one thing to remember is literally everything is a variable expense if you consider a long enough timeline. I mean, if you consider rent over the next 3 years, you could make changes so that your rent is not something that's fixed from one month to another. You could move to a new place. So fixed versus variable all depends on the timeline or the time frame that you're looking at. So with your expenses, we need to track them and we need to align our expenses with our goals. So the first step, where is all this money going? Well, that's what your Project 6 is all about. Hopefully you're learning and making progress with that Project 6. And so the lesson here is keep a budget. It's really easy to do these days. There's not really a reason not to. And on top of this, it's not just track, but once you track, you can start monitoring whether your expenses align with your goals. So one major issue with aligning your expenses with your goals is that sometimes or often you don't agree with you on what you should spend money on. And so you spend money on something now, and tomorrow you says, we shouldn't have spent money on that. Essentially, you are fighting with yourself across time. I like to call this time-traveling economic combat. The economist Steve Landsberg once called this the central banker of the soul. So countries historically have not done a great job with keeping inflation in check when the politicians have access to the printing press so that they can print themselves money. And so what countries have done is that they've kind of pushed this organization, the central bank, off to the side because they tend to be more responsible as an independent entity rather than being run by politicians. In the same way, we have the same conflict with ourselves, and sometimes we make decisions to restrict our own decisions, like putting the credit card in the block of ice or something like that, to try and help us make better decisions on our own. So I like calling it time-traveling economic combat. So in dealing with yourself, these three things: be self-aware, make sure to remember your true goals and to remind yourself of them, and to keep an eye on your budget. And if you're doing these three things, you tend to actually do okay. So we're going to be diving into specific expense categories now. So here's a question for you. What do you believe are the highest expense categories for the median American family? What would you guess? Take a moment. What do you think would be number 1, number 2, and number 3? Now this could be measured in different ways, but here's one popular method that's been used. Is that housing comes in first place, transportation comes in second place, and food and drink comes in third place. Healthcare can bump up significantly depending on how you're counting, say, employer contributions or other sources. But generally, it's these four that come in as the top expenses. Now, before we dive into the individual categories of expenses, I wanted to do a quick aside on automation, and there's a useful article below as well. As you go through the article, I recommend being able to answer the questions, say to someone else or to yourself, what is automation and what are the benefits of automation? And my answer, my description to those would be primarily that automation helps utilize that central banker of the soul, as we discussed, because automation means you have to make good decisions one time instead of every single month. On top of that, automation saves hundreds of hours per year so that I can focus on other things. So what does automation actually look like in my life? Well, it looks like income being automatically deposited into my account from my work or projects that I'm working on. It means that savings and investments are taken out automatically every single month. It means that all of my major payments are made all at once to the extent possible. So health insurance, credit card, etc. That's kind of a nice to have, but not as necessary. But to the extent that that's possible, that's great. All my other bills are just paid automatically. And finally, I'm automatically tracking all of these expenses, and I know exactly where all of that money is going. And that took a significant amount of work to set up for the first time. But once that was going, it's just running on pretty much autopilot, and I'm making great decisions within personal finance every single month. But I only had to make that decision once. So let's start automating yourself. So what I like to call step 0 is that you need to have a cushion. You can't do automation if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're asking yourself, do I have enough money to pay this bill? Automation will crush you. It will be a mess. Because what can happen is that you don't have enough to pay a certain bill. You try to draw on it anyway. You end up with insufficient funds. The bank penalizes you $20, $40, $60, whatever your insufficient funds penalty is. Maybe you get hit with 2, 3, 5 insufficient funds penalties, one after another. And that's just going to create more work for you and just create a huge headache. So once we have enough money, what we need to start doing is to automatically save and invest some of that money. If you work somewhere where 401k matching is a possibility, well, we will talk more about this in section 6, but for now you need to know that matching is free money, and we always say yes to free money. Again, we'll hit that in section 6, so don't worry too much about it, but as far as automation is concerned, that's what you need to know about 401k matching. And so part of this as well with automation is that you can deposit a portion of your income into these separate non-retirement savings that you could use for more significant purchases, say a car or a big bill that comes due or something big in your house breaks or something like that. So what is the advantage of this? It's the central banker of our souls. By doing this automatically, we don't have to trust future self to do something, or we don't make a bad decision today that future self then regrets. Step 2, with your expenses, you need to set up autopay for all of your bills. So it automatically pay your credit card, automatically pay all of your other bills. It saves massive amounts of your time. You're not getting inundated with mail. You don't actually miss something in the mail. Everything works a lot easier. Now, this does not mean you are not tracking your expenses, remember? You're still monitoring that, but you're doing it in a way that is more convenient and automated. Step 3 are the credit card expenses. So there are certain advantages to using a credit card and paying it off in full every month. You're not hit with any interest charges. First, some auto pays can be easier with a credit card rather than a debit card, although debit card frequently works as well. Tracking can be easier, although again, a debit card can work just as well most of the time. You can use programs like, say, Mint, YNAB, and some others to help you do that. You can also get cash back or points if you have good credit, and we'll talk more about credit cards later. However, there are definitely disadvantages of a credit card. If you don't pay it off in full every month, of course, you get hit with interest charges. And maybe you are trying to pay off a credit card in full every month, but you accidentally have insufficient funds or something bad occurs. So automation, step 3 with credit cards, this is something you can do, but is not exactly required. It can work well, or it could also backfire depending on your personal situation. So should you implement this step? Well, it depends. It depends on your situation. The last topic that we'll cover today is with food expenses. And this is something that I find quite interesting about restaurants and bars versus groceries. And in 2015, restaurants and bars actually tied up with the amount of money that was spent at groceries for the first time ever. Now, why is this happening? It's because of you millennials, you lazy... No, just kidding. We'll talk about why it's happening. Primarily, it's happening because of convenience, and people find it more convenient to spend money at, say, a restaurant rather than buy groceries and then spend time preparing it. However, that does come at a cost. So even though the amount spent matches across the two categories, the amount of food you receive does not match because food is generally 2 to 5 times more expensive when eating at a restaurant, sometimes much more than that, depending on the restaurant. And also, alcohol and other beverages are generally 4 to 10 times more expensive when you're out at a bar or a restaurant rather than, say, at a grocery store. Now, I've included 2 articles from Mr. Money Mustache, who's an interesting character, below. With Mr. Money Mustache, frequently, even if you don't completely subscribe to what his approach or what he's trying to do, he brings up some really interesting points. And in regards to this specific area about food, this is no exception. Now, he walks through about the cost per person per meal, and he makes the point that you can eat a great meal that's tasty and healthy for around $1.33 per person per meal. And say, if you're going out to eat somewhere relatively inexpensive, you could spend, say, $6 per meal for maybe worse food. And so his point is, if we put in a little bit of time for the preparation, we can end up with healthier and better food for just costing a little bit of preparation and time. And so for his example, it was saving $580 per month per person, which over 10 years for him was $100,000 with interest. Another point is that, the cheapest foods, contrary to, public opinion, actually tend to be okay on the healthiness spectrum. Now, the second cheapest foods tend to be terrible for you. But the cheapest foods tend to be pretty healthy. And what is some evidence of that? Well, if you look around the world of those living in quite poor conditions, they are not eating that horrible for you food. They tend to be eating, well, it's basically rice and beans, which tend to be relatively inexpensive. In the end, the main point that I would take away is that, and something that just kind of applied to my life, is that just by making a few adjustments in my life, I saved around about, now it's not quite as drastic as Mr. Money Mustache's, but I was saving around $1,000 per year, and I was eating healthier and eating better food, all because I implemented a little bit of planning and a little bit more preparation than I otherwise would. So this is something that's, while it's not going to be a huge amount of money difference, it is something that in the end it's a win-win situation for you with a little bit of planning and preparation. So you turn brave and you say, okay, so I'm going to get some healthy, delicious, awesome food at the grocery store instead of at, say, a restaurant. Well, that's where Article 2 steps in, and it's walking through how to save money at a grocery store, and it comes down to just a few things of knowing the right price for things, using healthiness and cost per calorie to know what to eat, not just what's tasty, but focusing on health as well. He makes a few suggestions, such as avoiding cutesy containers, buying private label, and also making a plan before you go in. Finally, he makes this point about buying lots when things are on discount, and you don't buy as much when it's more expensive. And he used a pretty simple example of how he implemented a relatively simple plan on what he was purchasing in order to save $100 per year. Again, nothing here is all that crazy. to implement. But the underlying lesson of if you go to the grocery store with a plan in mind, you can often end up saving a lot more money and ending up with something that tastes better and also is better for you. As far as other purchases, you should know that cigarettes, alcohol, and cannabis can be expensive if they are habits. And it's partly due to the products themselves, how much they cost, but it's also due to the governments that they put heavy taxes, excise taxes, sometimes they call them sin taxes, on cigarettes, alcohol, and cannabis. Also with alcohol, it can be really expensive when drinking out because a markup of about 10 times is actually quite common, depending on where it is. And so if becomes a regular habit, it can start consuming a large percentage of your budget. Lastly, many illicit drugs have actually become quite cheap over the last 15 years. But then again, it still becomes pricey because, you develop tolerance and addiction to illicit drugs tend to muck up other goals even if they're, cost half as much as they did 10 or 15 years ago. So just a few things to keep in mind.